Hey, today we're going to talk about Africa and the level playing field again. And how did these European nations like Belgium and France and Britain have the authority to colonize other countries? And as I mentioned, this is specifically focused on Africa, but obviously colonization happened in other areas. Like, how did that come to be? Who gave them the permission to do that? Well, that's what we're going to break down today. Hey, welcome to the show. Molly here. Today we're going to talk about two things relating to the level playing field in Africa. And if you haven't watched the other videos in the series, I will link them in the description. But the intention here is I'm learning about the history of Africa, specifically as it relates to mineral oil rights, drilling rights, and how kind of the situation came to be where all of these countries were colonized by European powers, which, it sounds a little crazy to me today. Like, imagine just going into another country and just deciding, well, this country is now mine, and having the rest of the world be okay with that. It is interesting because we do live in this era where there's discussion of colonizing places like Mars, and I don't know if that's going to happen. My point is, that discussion just brings up, well, how did people colonize things in the past? Like, what happens if we go to Mars, hypothetically, just for argument's sake, and there's like a bunch of people living there? Like, what do? Do you all live together? Do you kick them out? I grew up in an era where we were told this kind of crazy story about the Pilgrims. And, when I was little, every year there'd be like a Thanksgiving, like play at school for like little kids, like 6, 7, 8 years old, where you would pretend that everybody, the Pilgrim, half the class dressed up as Pilgrims, half the class dressed up as Native Americans, we call them Indians then. And we'd have this like fun little banquet and like everybody got along great. Well, I don't think that's the reality of how colonization worked. And there's a couple things that happened many, many years ago that kind of created the conditions by which countries like Belgium, France, Portugal, Britain, Germany were able to colonize Africa. So it began with the Vatican. Now, if you are red-pilled and you've gone down some of these rabbit holes, you're aware of the Vatican's dark past. And what happened really was in the Middle Ages, the Vatican and the Catholic Church was a very powerful authority figure, not only spiritually, but politically. Like, they ruled the papal states in Italy, and they were often seen as the arbiter of disputes between Christian country leaders. And as I was studying the past couple of weeks, a lot of history from the late 1800s, all these leaders were related, like Queen Victoria, Otto von Bismarck, Leopold II. They're all like literally like cousins. Like, Queen Victoria was like the grandmother of a couple of these leaders. So it's funny that they would go to like war with each other when they're like actually related to each other. And it does really support this belief that like there's this oligarchy of elites who are very separate from us, and they care about their bloodlines because they literally are all related to each other. All right, so the Vatican has this position of authority. They can issue these things called papal bulls. I don't know if it's papal or papal or whatever, but they're basically like edicts. Like, the Pope would state a decree, like, this thing is fact. And because all of these other Christian countries in Europe kind of saw the Vatican as the arbiter of disputes, and the Pope could grant authority to king. Like, you were given legitimacy as a king if you like stole it from another king, if the Pope kind of blessed you. So people looked up to the Pope as sort of the settler of disputes. And this is going to become relevant later on. And so back in the Middle Ages, the Vatican kind of secured their position as leaders. And because they obviously were Catholic Church, they gave preference to people who were Catholics. And I think they generally call them Christians, although there's many kinds of Christianity now that are not just specifically Catholicism. But let's not get into that part. All right, so countries decide they want to start colonizing and they need some legitimacy. So the Catholic Church, in the name of spreading their religion and kind of, it's like growing market share essentially, kind of decided that it was okay for Christian countries to go and spread Christianity, even if that meant like taking over their land. And so they created this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery, which gave Christian nations permission in their mind to go and colonize other places. And it kind of, I think, started with Portugal, and then kind of other European countries hopped on it. What's interesting, I'm going to pop forward to today, modern times, is that in 2023, so like 2 years ago, the Vatican backtracked on this and said that the doctrine of discovery really didn't align with their views on how people should be treated. And they kind of like took it back, which means very interesting implications for modern day countries that were colonized. If this was done under the authority of the Vatican, and the Vatican has now said, oops, sorry, that really wasn't an ethical or potentially even lawful approach, does that mean you could have legal standing to dispute those borders or policies or property rights agreements? This is where it's going to get juicy. Okay, so the Vatican is now backtracked, but now we're going to go back in time. And I'm focusing for this on a couple of countries. One of them is the Congo, and the Congo was colonized by Belgium in the late 1800s. And this guy, real piece of work, this one, King Leopold II, just decided that Belgium was pretty small. They didn't have a lot of resources. So in order for him to become immensely wealthy, he needed to like have a colony where he could exploit it. And the Congo is huge. It's like the size of the southeastern United States. Big place, lots of resources. And back then it was primarily rubber and ivory that were valuable. This is, lithium really wasn't a thing back then. No, there was cobalt. All right, so Leopold decides that he wants to take the Congo, but the problem is like a whole lot of Congolese people live there and own the land. And so he needed legal justification to steal it. Now, the doctrine of discovery had given him permission to do that, but, he kind of wanted more. So what he did is he called up his buddy, which is probably his cousin. I'm sure they were related. I haven't looked on the lineage exactly. Otto von Bismarck, the leader of Germany, and was like, hey, I want you to have this conference where we can, work out some humanitarian issues in Africa and, help all these African people who in their mind were uncivilized. We'll keep that word specifically. We'll get back to that word a little bit later. It's relevant. And so Germany has this conference called the 1884 Berlin Conference, where under the guise of benevolent humanitarian gestures of wanting to help people, they pretended that, they partitioned up Africa. And from this conference, Congo was kind of deemed by the other European leaders to now be an asset of Leopold II. It was not an asset of Belgium, the country. It was his personal thing. So he just went and decided this country is now mine. I own it. I own all of the resources, which includes the people. And he got the blessing essentially of these other major European powers, which at the time was, Germany, Britain, France, Portugal. And they kind of all now agreed that the Congo was his. He renamed it the Congo Free State and made these kind of claims that he was this benevolent leader. Over the next decades, horrific things happened in the Congo. Millions and millions of Congolese people were starved or died, enslaved. I mean, many of them starved, but they died, murdered, enslaved. They had to work in these rubber plantations. And if they didn't meet their numbers, often people were like, their hands were chopped off, like horribly terrible things. People just lived in a state of terror because what was formerly a probably beautiful, lush, peaceful place became absolutely miserable under Leopold's, quote, leadership. And the funny thing is, like decades later, even back in the 1960s, when Congo was looking to be liberated, they still had these policies where they would the Belgians would hand select Congolese people that they thought were evolved. They have like the French word or Flemish word, like évolué, something. Sorry, I'm not pronouncing it correctly. But the point was they were looking for people that they considered evolved to kind of put into leadership roles. And, they had kind of claimed that Belgium had civilized the Congo. There's no definition of civilization to me that if you are leading people and they are working for you, let's even pretend he was paying them, and they don't make their number, you chop their hands off. Like there's nothing civilized or evolved about that. And the world started to wake up to the fact that this guy was brutally terrorizing and murdering Congolese people. And by the early 20th century, the early 1900s, there was a public uproar about this. And Leopold was forced to sell the Congo to the Belgian government um, because it was just like people were up in arms. And what's crazy is that like colonization was widely accepted as okay. And this was still an era when there was a lot of slavery. So for there to be uproar about what Leopold was doing, considering a lot of Europeans turned a blind eye to horrific things at that time, like it had to be really bad. So I mean, I really do think like a demon lived inside Leopold, maybe Satan himself, who knows? For someone to be this cold-hearted and have no regard at all for human life is just a gross thing. Okay, so we can talk about that more, but the point I'm really trying to make here is that when Leopold had to sell it to the Belgian government, and then the Belgian government in the 1960s negotiated kind of a liberation of the Congolese people. It's not really clear how all the mineral rights and land rights and property rights were transferred. Now, people may have been allowed to have elections and allowed to vote for leaders that may or may not have been selected by the Belgian government, which we've kind of seen. But did the Belgians even have the authority to make those deals? Because if you go back to the doctrine of discovery being the impetus for this colonization being okay, and the Vatican now retracting that, does that mean that all of these agreements that have been made since that time, and in the case of the Congo, since Leopold in 1884, if they're all null and void, like what does that mean for today? Interesting question. Because if you're going to make a legal case that, you know, the property rights that are in place now have some kind of standing, it's like a house of cards, and we've now pulled that foundation out from under it. Like if the foundation that all of these current contracts, and I'm even talking about oil rights and mineral rights with Western mining companies, if they are all built on a flawed doctrine that has been since rescinded by the issuer of it, what does that mean for today? Going back to Leopold and this conference of 1884, reading about this sounded so familiar to these like global leaders who do these climate change conferences where they kind of fly around and sort of act like they're, trying to fix the problems of the world, which usually end up taxing people. A COP24, like there's been a whole bunch of them, the Paris Accords, all these agreements. It's exactly the same thing where you have these very arrogant, wealthy, completely out of touch leaders making a land grab of some sorts, but publicly stating that it was in the name of, helping people, which was totally a lie then, as it is totally a lie today. And the interesting thing in another book, so I'm reading right now, I'm about to finish it, a book on the history of South Africa, really about this guy named Cecil Rhodes. You've been heard Rhodes Scholar, he's that guy, but he was a English guy who colonized isn't really a word, English guy who started De Beers, the diamond company, had also some major gold holdings, very wealthy guy, was prime minister for a while, was very power hungry, got caught up in a scandal where he was trying to overthrow like another guy who was like the governor of a neighboring area, Paul Kruger, and got busted for it. So couldn't be prime minister anymore. And he had this same type of arrogance that, the world, anything that he could take, he would take. The world belonged to him. And he was trying to, make these moves on behalf of the British government. But one of the things that Cecil Rhodes did early on in his career was he bought newspapers. And he very clearly bought them with the intention of managing public perceptions. And when there was an issue, he would have the editors write something to support his cause. And so even back in the 1800s, it was pretty clear that media was used as a propaganda tool. And the same thing happened with this issue with 1884 conference when, these countries were trying to colonize Africa. They used the media to get citizens of these European nations to agree that this was okay. And so it's just amazing that we live in this era now where people are still discussing whether or not you can trust mainstream media. When I was like, this problem has been going back hundreds of years. Since the beginning of media, leaders with agendas have been buying and owning these media companies. Back then it was really newspapers. Today it's obviously TV and internet as well, for the specific intention of supporting their own agendas with no regard at all for what is honorable, ethical, or truthful. And so I think it's fascinating that not enough of us have read books for our lifetime to even have this silly discussion about the integrity of the modern mainstream media, knowing they are owned by the same people who went to the Berlin Conference, who hung out with Cecil Rhodes, who believed in the doctrine of discovery, because they are the people who have the money and the ability to buy media companies. So I'm bouncing all over the place here. What is interesting, though, is in 2023, as I said, the Vatican retracted their position on doctrine of discovery, which has led to kind of a global questioning and uproar about, well, how do we undo this? Do we need reparations? Do we just kick out all of the people? Like in the case of Africa, do you just kick out all the former Europeans who live there? I think that would be a drastic solution because, nobody alive today implemented these policies. Now, obviously, the harm of these policies is still in place. But if you just kick out every mining company out of Africa, how does that help the impoverished African people? I don't know. It probably doesn't. Now, there are obviously environmental concerns to mining. It can be very destructive to the water supply and to the land. You can't farm it once it's been mined. You can't really live on it. I think there are ethical considerations around mining, but the reality is that the world wants a lot of these minerals that are being mined. And so if they are being mined, why not set up all the African people to receive royalties like they have in Alaska? And the uber wealthy who own all these assets, they don't work. They live off royalties as well. So I think that one potential solution that's worthy of exploring is renegotiating a lot of these agreements that could legally be considered null and void because the doctrine of discovery, which is the foundation upon which they were all built, has now been retracted by the Vatican. So how could you even use that as a legal basis at this time? I don't know. Now, there have been some court cases in the US around Native American lands and doctrine of discovery being retracted and saying that they, want the property rights back. And it has not gone well for the indigenous populations. But if at first you don't succeed, you try again. And I have not found, fortunately, we live in this era of AI where I can ask questions like, have there been any lawsuits in Africa specifically to challenge these property rights? And as far as I know, there have not been, which is why we live in an exciting time where we have blockchain technology that could allow royalty payments to be distributed automatically to citizens. You have situations where, we're seeing kind of an awareness of a lot of the corruption that is going on, and the fact that foreign aid has been used nefariously to really kind of buy off people and hasn't benefited most people in poor countries in Africa, for example. If it did, the United States has been giving, so I have not been giving foreign aid to anybody. The United States Corporation has been giving foreign aid to people since the 60s, almost, 76, 60 years, whatever. If it was such an effective solution, then there wouldn't be any more poverty there. And I don't think that is the case at all. So issuing royalties as a way to send money directly to people on an ongoing basis is a potential solution that is worth discussion, or it could be the answer. I'm not really sure. We're kind of working to figure that out. So thank you for following along in this series, kind of as I explore this topic. I like to make videos to sort of talk about it. I'm certainly no expert on these topics as they are kind of new to me and I'm studying them. So if I've been factually inaccurate in anything, feel free to let me know in the comments. And next, we'll be back soon with the next one in the series. See ya.